It's the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. Argentina's neoliberal president, Mauricio Macri, announced on Wednesday that his government is requesting a $30 billion credit line from the International Monetary Fund. The announcement sparked immediate rejection from large parts of Argentine society, and demonstrations against the move were organized the same day. The reason Macri's announcement to go to the IMF was so controversial is that many, perhaps most, Argentines blamed the IMF for the country's massive economic crisis of 2001, when poverty skyrocketed within a matter of months. Here's what a leader of Argentina's Education Workers Union had to say at Wednesday's protest.
We've already lived through this. We don't want to go back to the International Monetary Fund. 80% of Argentina is opposed to the president's statements, and that's why we're getting mobilized.
So what happened? Why is Argentina heading to the IMF again? Joining me to explore this and related questions is Mark Weisbrot. Mark is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and is the author of the book Failed: What the Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy. Thanks for joining us again, Mark.
Thanks, Gregory. Good to be here.
So Macri came into office in December 2015, promising to apply neoliberal reforms to Argentina. So one would think that capital markets would play along with him and make things easier in some sense. But still, the Argentine currency has dropped almost 20% since the beginning of the year. And despite raising interest rates to 40%, Macri has not been able to stop the slide. So why is Argentina now going to the IMF, and what is the significance of doing this?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons he would go to the IMF. I mean, first of all, he's, like you said, he set up this whole kind of neoliberal program, which inflation targeting, which means the central bank is not supposed to pay any attention to the exchange rate, the currency floats, and he had to float the currency. I mean, that was a reasonable thing to do when he took office. But if you're going to have that promise to investors, and then all of a sudden the currency starts to fall and you intervene with $4 billion like they did just recently, buying your currency, then they start to wonder, well, is the central bank really in charge? Who's in charge here? So the markets reacted very badly, partly because he created this expectation of this kind of perfect neoliberal regime. And at the same time, he also borrowed a lot internationally, a huge increase in international borrowing, running a current account, which is mostly trade deficit of 4.6% of GDP. And so all of this presents, it's more of a long-term problem than an immediate one. But the markets reacted very badly because of the signals the kind of mixed signals that the government was sending. And there's other things too. I mean, there's a lot of multiple causality here. There's a lot of things, whenever the markets do something that isn't completely rational, it's not completely rational, there's a whole bunch of things you can point to, and some of them are real. So for all the other thing is that the Fed is, raising interest rates, and you don't know what's going to happen with that. Right now they're set on 2 or possibly 3 increases this year. But, U.S. Treasury rates have been rising. And so there's a risk that capital just flies out of there for that reason. And you see this in some other countries, and you don't know what's going to happen to the international economy because of that. And so the government has pointed to that as well. But I think all of these things, especially the rapid increase in foreign borrowing, the increase in the current account deficit, and the government's lack of a coherent policy from its supporters and fans in the markets point of view are what caused this crisis.
So Macri, of course, blames the previous government of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who left office about 2.5 years ago, for his economic problems. He recently said, as a matter of fact, quote, "The problem we have is that we are among the countries in the world that most depend on external financing, the product of huge public spending that we inherited." Is there any truth to this? And just how did Argentines do under the prior government, and how have they done since Macri took office?
Well, first of all, Argentines did very well under the 13 years of the Kirchners. I mean, the poverty rate dropped from was reduced by 70% and extreme poverty by 80%. And that's using independent estimates of inflation, not the government's estimates. So nobody can argue with that. And you had unemployment fell from 17 to 6.5% during that period. Now it's gone up to about 8.5% under Macri, and he's raised utility prices, which has hit people very hard. In fact, has also contributed about 5 percentage points to the 25% inflation that they have now, although he's reduced inflation from what they had. So I mean, the short answer is they did very well after the terrible experience of the IMF, which was, one of their worst depressions from 1998 to the beginning of 2002. And that's why they were popular, and that's why Cristina was reelected. And if she could have run again, she would still be there. And so he has, he has definitely hurt the majority of Argentines since he's been in office, even though the economy is now growing, and now he's facing an economic crisis.
So back in 2012, the U.S. courts played a major role in making Argentina's economic situation more difficult than it had to be by making the default more painful when so-called vulture funds hijacked an agreement with creditors. And they were insisting on being paid in full for their debt. So what is happening now with regard to U.S. involvement in Argentina's economy this time around?
Well, they were involved from the beginning of his term because, first of all, the court that you mentioned that took over 90% of the creditors hostage in order to pay the vulture funds, Judge Griesa in, I think it was February of 2016, just a couple months after Macri was elected, said, well, this changes everything, and he lifted the injunction. So that was, obviously, that's the judicial branch of the U.S. government, but it was a very powerful force. And then the U.S. unblocked loans from multilateral lending institutions that had blocked under the prior government in order to help Macri. And here's Macri coming to Washington, his finance minister came to Washington yesterday and speaks not only to the IMF, but to the Treasury Department, which of course is going to decide what the IMF does and what conditions they're going to place on the lending in Argentina. And it is a really historic deja vu, of course, for people, as you mentioned. I mean, it's kind of like, the Iraqi government inviting the U.S. to invade again, some 13 years later or 15 years later. And so this is the U.S. has always been heavily involved in this decision-making in Argentina, and Macri is very strongly aligned with the U.S. government. However, that doesn't mean he's going to get a great deal from the IMF, because part of the reason he's going to the IMF is he wants the IMF to be responsible for the decisions that he's going to make in the coming months that are going to hurt the majority of people in Argentina.
Well, just very quickly, what kinds of decisions could we expect in that direction?
I think you can expect more of these kind of neoliberal reforms, more cuts to social spending, and government spending in general. I think you're going to see basically the strategy of the IMF in many of these places and in neoliberal governments is to reduce the trade or current account deficit by shrinking the economy. If you shrink the economy, that's how you lower your imports. What they really need is a strategy to increase their exports, but they can't really do that under the kind of economic and ideological constraints that they have.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there for now. I was speaking to Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thanks again, Mark, for having joined us today.
Thank you, Gregory.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.